Book of Joshua. We had 2 lessons on it so far. Hopefully this will be our last one. There's quite a bit of material here. Several chapters are devoted to actually the placement of land for the 12 tribes. So we did not go into any detail upon that. I'd like to go back to chapter 10. We're going to look at chapters 10, 14, 20, 21, 23, 24. We may not get through all that. But each one of those has some very significant parts as far as the life of Joshua is concerned. He was the leader who took the place of Moses, a military leader as well, one who took the children of Israel over into the promised land and is now at this point helping them conquer all the nations called Canaanites. They're divided up into all different groups, but the general term is Canaanites. They're Hittites, Hivites, Amorites, all kind of ites. But they're all under the same thing. They're all from Canaan, Canaanites. And we'll notice something here in a moment about their religion. It was very corrupt, very wicked religion. It was idolatry, many idols. They believed in sacrificing little children, killing them. They believed in part of their worship, orgies in their worship, which made it very attractive even to not only to them, but to some of the Jewish people as well. They had male and female prostitutes, so that when you went to the temple to worship, you would also have sexual relations with them. So that it was very corrupt, and this is one of the reasons that God destroyed all the nations in Canaan. None of them came to him, even though he gave them plenty of time over the years. They were all corrupt, and now they were going to be destroyed. They were going to be destroyed and make the way for God's people. Now, some people think that God is cruel. They think that God is wrong in annihilating those people. But we know that God made us. We know that He takes sin seriously, and He will punish sin. He will punish our sin. He'll punish our nation's sin, and He'll punish our personal sin if we do not repent. So Joshua has taken them into the promised land, clearing the way for them to have their homes and businesses and their own land. And we're going to see in chapter 10 something that we already looked at once before. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it. But we just studied this particular event when we talked about the miracles of the Old Testament. One of the miracles of the Old Testament that was outstanding is when the sun stood still for a day so that Joshua could win this battle that he was having. There was 5 kings in chapter 10 who went and attacked the Gibeonites. Now, I need a little bit of a refresher here from somebody who can remember this. Remember, the Jews, the Israelites, made peace with the Gibeonites. They were not to make peace with any of the Canaanites. Now, these were Canaanites too. But why did he do it? Does anybody remember? Bread and old clothes. Yeah, they deceived Israel. And the Bible says that one of the things that happened is that Joshua and them did not go to God and find out about these things. But they were afraid of being destroyed because they figured out that that's what God is intending for them. So they pretended that they were from a far-off country when they were only like 15 miles from Jerusalem. And they brought old clothes, like she said, and brought food that was all dried up. And they said, we're from a land far away. Well, it turned out they weren't from a land far away. They were just a few miles away. And they made an agreement with the Jews that let us carry your water and be slaves, and we'll be friends. So they went ahead and agreed to do it because they promised them they would. Now it turns out these Gibeonites are going to be attacked by 5 kings. So they're going to Joshua and saying, oh, come and help us. We're your brothers. Come and help us. So that's what's happening here in chapter 10. I'll not read the whole chapter. I'll read several verses. If you have it, your Bible's in front of you. Look at chapter 10, starting with verse 3. We're going to see the names of the kings and where they were from. And then we're going to see how God defeats them. Now, please pay attention to this. It's pointed out here that more of these kings were destroyed by an act of God than they were by the army. And this shows that people like Joshua and all the others should not get overconfident thinking that they were doing this themselves. It was actually God doing and winning the battle. Now look at verse 3. So Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, appealed to Hoham, king of Hebron. So we have the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Deber, king of Eglon. Come up and help me attack Gibeon, because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites. Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, joined forces. They moved up with all their troops, took up positions against Gibeon, and attacked it. The Gibeonites sent word to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly, save us, help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country had joined forces against us. Verse 7 says, Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army. Verse 9 says, after an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. Now notice verse 10, the Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. So God is the one that confused these kings. So Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely. Now drop down in verse 11 and see what else God did for them. As they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth-horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them. And notice this, more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. Now I want you to notice this other tremendous miracle, starting with verse 12 that we discussed before when we were talking about miracles. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, stand still. In other words, he said, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you moon over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still. Now you talk about a miracle. This means that it affected the whole balance of the earth. And the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. Now this is very interesting, I think, what it says about Joshua. I was talking about what a good man Joshua was. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down for a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Isn't that interesting? All right. Now, in verse 20, before we leave chapter 10, it says, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely. Verse 26, then Joshua put the kings to death and exposed their bodies on 5 poles, and they were left hanging on the poles till evening. Verse 27, he threw them into a cave where they had been hiding. At the mouth of the cave, they placed the large rocks which are there to this day. Now, the other chapters, 11, 12, talks about the list of the defeated kings. Chapter 13 talks about land being given to the 12 tribes. want us to look at chapter 14 for a moment, just to notice about Caleb. Now, does anybody remember what Caleb was? He was a spy, along with Joshua, who went over to the promised land with 10 other spies, one from each tribe, to see if they could go in and conquer. Just 2 of them said that we can do it. Who were they? Joshua and Caleb. So the Lord was going to reward these 2. The other 10 died with all of the other Israelites who complained and moaned and groaned because they had to go into the promised land, because they thought they'd all get killed. But their children went into the promised land and were very safe and were protected. So these 2 men are going to receive benefits from God. Now, verse 6 says, "Now the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, said to him." Now here Caleb is reminding Joshua what Moses promised to give him. He said, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land." He says in verse 8, "I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly." Now we're going to notice how old Caleb is. He was 40 when he started out. Look at verse 10. He says, "So here I am today, 85 years old." But notice what he says about his age. "I'm still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out and battle now as I was then. Now give me the hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourselves heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities large and fortified." But notice, even he wasn't afraid. "But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said." And then we see following with it that Joshua gives him that land. I just wanted to give you that insight on Caleb. When we get into the book of Judges, Caleb's son-in-law, Othniel, is one of the judges. So that's kind of interesting, but that's all I want to say about that now. So we're going to move on to see some more facts. We're not going to worry about the territory and who gets what. We're going to see more facts about the men themselves. So I want you to go to chapter 20. Chapter 20 is interesting because you'll notice in the heading over your chapter, it says cities of refuge. God established cities of refuge to help people who were either accidentally, unintentionally killed somebody. Now we know that happens. That's called, what is it, the legal term for that? Huh? Manslaughter. Yeah, I think. Justifiable, maybe, I don't know. But anyhow, it was an accident, when it happened. And they weren't at fault. So any of those terms probably would justify it that you mentioned there. Would be an example of it, at least. That'd be an example of it. Well, what God did was he made arrangements that these people that did have a part in someone dying at something that they did, but that they didn't do it intentionally, by accident. They could run to this city and get help there. And we'll notice here something in the reading that I want to explain to you about how things were set up then as far as law and order. Kind of different than now. In chapter 20, verse 1, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, tell the Israelites to designate the cities of refuge, as I instructed you through Moses, so that anyone who kills a person accidentally and unintentionally may flee there and find protection. Now, this is what I wanted to point out. From the avenger of blood. Does anybody know who that would be? I think you touched on it. Go ahead, explain it. What did you say? Yeah. The family, he said, Father, the family of the victim. The family of the victim at this time had the right, maybe even the responsibility, to hunt down the one who killed him. Now, this is for a crime that they did on purpose, and to kill him. So that's why he's saying they'll be protected from the avenger of blood. Now, verse 5 says, if the avenger of blood comes in pursuit, the elders must not surrender the fugitive, because the fugitive killed their neighbor unintentionally and without malice aforethought. They are to stay in that city until they have stood trial before the assembly. Now, they have a trial there to determine whether or not that person was guilty or not. I mean, they just didn't take their word for it. And until, this is another interesting thing, they had to stay in the city until the death of the high priest who was serving at that time. So, that is a city of refuge. And it's interesting how the Lord provided for that, for those who accidentally killed someone else. You know, maybe one of your animals got in their way or something and killed them. Maybe, like on your property, they came and they fell or something like that. Just like today, even with our laws, it doesn't matter if you have a fence as high as, 30 foot. If somebody climbs the fence, gets in your property, and gets hurt, you're liable. So, so things like that happened then as well. Now we're going to see another thing that they did, and I'm just going to remind you of quickly. Towns for the Levites. Did the Levites, that's the priestly tribe who took care of all the religious details, did they get any land? No, you're right. What did they get? They got cities. They got 48 cities that were given to them. And it says in verse 8 of chapter 21, so the Israelites allotted to the Levites these towns, they named them, we're not going to, above there, and their pasture lands as the Lord had commanded through Moses. So they got towns with homes. Outside the towns, they got pasture lands. How else did they get money to survive? Huh? Yeah, temple what? Offerings, tithes. The tithes of the people went to support the Levites as well. So God took care of the religious realm. As you go to chapter 23, we notice Joshua's goodbye to the people. And I want to look at a few verses in that chapter as he talks to them about being faithful to the Lord when he dies. Now, I want to mention this quickly. As long as Joshua was alive, and that first generation of elders were alive, the people followed God. What do you think happened when all of them died? Huh? Went back the way they were, exactly. Started worshiping idols, started doing all that stuff. That's why when we get in the book of Judges, there's 15 judges, because God would punish them by a nation when they sinned. They'd do a little better, then they'd go back into sin. He'd send another judge, and then they would do good under that judge for a while. Then when that judge died, they'd start sinning again. So it was over and over and over. So just wanted you to be aware of that. But notice what Joshua says in chapter 23, starting with verse 2 towards the end of the verse. There he says, I am very old. You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Didn't give himself credit, didn't give the army credit. Remember how I've allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the lands of the nations that remain. Now look at verse 6. He's telling them, be very strong and careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not, now this is where they made their mistake. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them. But you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. Now, verse 14. Now I'm about to go to the way of all the earth. What does he mean by that? I'm going to die. I'm going to go to the way of all the earth. You know that with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. Now I want you to notice verse 16. Verse 16, I think, is the center of this book, even though it's towards the end of it. We've seen many plaques with the words from verse 16. In verse 16, he says, if you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you. Now, chapter 4, which is the last chapter, I said it wrong. I said chapter 23. Chapter 4, which is the last chapter, he again is encouraging them to be faithful. And we also have that very famous verse about himself and his family. Drop down to chapter 24, verse 14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Verse 15, look at the middle part. But choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my household, King James says my house, we will serve the Lord. I think that's a central theme of the whole book. And that's Joshua's beautiful words. All right, we'll close this chapter out by looking at verse 20 and 24 and one or two others. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you. Verse 24 says, and the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. Drop down to verse 29. After all these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. Verse 31. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Now, when we get over the Judges, you're going to see that they start right back in their old ways. So when we get into the book of Judges, that's the third generation. The first generation died in the wilderness for their disobedience. The second generation served the Lord faithfully under Joshua and the leaders who were the second generation. But the third generation went back into sin. So we're just a generation away from the annihilation of the church. Now, the church will always be here till Jesus comes, But the Bible often refers to it as a remnant. It's not going to be powerful and strong, just like the Jews weren't powerful and strong. They had a remnant of people that were faithful, even in spite of the fact that they did all this sinning and stuff. Anything anybody wants to say about what we read?